Hello, everyone. Thanks for watching. This is David Hopper, Austin Bureau Chief of the music site 360degreesound.com. As part of our ongoing Author Talk series, I'm going to be interviewing Steve Vass, a music journalist based in Glasgow, Scotland. We'll be discussing his excellent new book, Let the Music Play: How R&B Fell in Love with 80s Synths. Let the Music Play is the overlooked story of how R&B, disco, and funk were transformed by the explosion of music tech in the era of ghetto blasters and Ronald Reagan. Steve, thanks for joining 360 Sound.
Hey, thanks very much for having me.
Of course. Wonder if you could please start by telling us why you decided to write this book, Let the Music Play.
Okay, well, where do I start with that? I think I'd always intended to start writing journalistic books. I was a reporter for many years, and getting my teeth into big topics is always what I've really liked doing. And I'd finally kind of got my life to a place that I was able to really focus properly on some sort of big topics. And I was thinking, well, what would I like to do? Love to do a music book, maybe a number of music books. But I thought, I kind of pivoted towards this topic partly because I'm a child of the 80s, born in 75, so I was 5 to 15 through the decade. It's very much my childhood decade. And the way that it's sort of remembered in this, it's kind of well loved. If you look at the stats for radio play of all the kind of decades of yesteryear, the 80s gets far more airplay both in the UK and in the US than any other prior decade before about 2010. But it tends to be that I think it's loved in a slightly sort of ironic way. I mean, and the songs that get a lot of airplay, the Duran Durans, the Ahas, and sure the Princes and the Michael Jacksons as well. I feel like quite a lot of it is loved, a little bit in a nostalgia way. And it's kind of, I don't think it's taken as seriously by kind of heavyweight music fans as the 60s or 70s, whether you're talking about Motown or the kind of British beat invasion or kind of serious 70s funk or whatever. So I felt like it was it's sort of a decade that ought to be taken a bit more seriously than it really is. And then I was thinking, well, what would I like to talk about? I kind of gravitated towards R&B, partly just because I'm such a huge fan of a lot of that music, but also because I feel like I mean, and again, when you look back at the kind of stuff that gets all the airplay, as I say, the kind of examples that I gave, to me, it doesn't encompass what I remember about the 80s. There were a lot of groups that I used to see on TV or hear on the radio when I was growing up that are completely forgotten now, and most of them kind of fall into the black R&B sort of category. I'm thinking of people like Imagination, who were from London. I'm thinking about Colonel Abrahams, Gwen Guthrie, Sky. A lot of these acts. It's almost as if the Michael Jacksons and Princes and Whitneys kind of were so big that it's almost as if there's not enough room left to appreciate a lot of the other great black artists that were there at the time. It's kind of how it sort of felt to me. So I thought that's an interesting area to kind of focus on. And then also, I mean, I've always been a huge lover of synth music and electronic music. And it kind of, as I started digging into this, I thought, one thing that's very interesting here is that when you look at the way that we think of, when you ask the average person on the street, what do you think of when you think about early synth music or synth pop or something? Certainly in this country, people are liable to say Depeche Mode or the Human League or Kraftwerk, and they're very unlikely to say Stevie Wonder or Ike Turner or D Train or something like that. So it felt to me like we don't attach synth music half as much to black artists as we should. And then I mean, I sort of talk about in the intro to the book about how there was this meme that was doing the rounds on social media a year or two back, where um, electronic music, the history of electronic music was represented by this solar system, where you had the sun in the middle was Kraftwerk, and then you had various kind of concentric circles representing all the planets revolving around it, and the asteroid belt and all the rest of it. And it was pretty much, it was all the Human Leagues and the Depeche Modes, and the only black artists in the entire image where I think it was the Belleville Three and Lee Scratch Perry, and that was it. And I just thought, this really just sums it up for me. There's really when you put these things together, underappreciated R&B from that era, and black artists in general being really underappreciated for their for what they did with synths. I just thought, that's a topic I would really like to explore. But then at the same time, I then say to myself, well, okay, there's definitely something to be said here. But I'm a white guy from Glasgow, and most of this music happened in America, and it mostly wasn't white people. So maybe I'm not the right person to do this. So I kind of went back and forth with it for a couple of months, and I took soundings from various friends, some of whom are big fans of this music, and I got in touch with various organizations in America, and people that were that I thought would have an interesting take on this, or could maybe just guide me as to whether they thought it was a good idea. People that have a standing in a kind of black cultural spaces or whatever, and I mean, and to be frank, quite a few of them actually didn't get back to me, but the ones that did were generally very encouraging. They gave me some quite good advice, but I just felt, actually, the more I think about it, it's been 40 years. If somebody doesn't do this quite soon, I mean, enough of these people that were key to this have passed already, and that's only going to continue to happen. And I just thought, you know what, I'm actually just going to do this. And that was how it came about. So yeah, that was about 2 years ago, and here we are. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Right. Yeah, very, very important book that needed to be written for sure. Uh, yeah, I wonder if you could kind of like set the stage for this genre of music, 80s synth funk and R&B. I mean, the book describes a number of uh events and moments that kind of led up to this. But if you wanted to highlight, one or two kind of pivotal moments and innovations that they kind of paved the way for this style of music.
Okay, yeah, I mean, like you would expect, there are many. But if you were going to boil it down, what would you say? Well, you would have to say the invention of synths. Well, that kind of goes back to, I think, the 50s, but they start to become a bit more manageable in the 60s, where they're called the modular Moog comes along, which is yeah, without getting into too much detail, it basically looks like a telephone exchange. It's covered in knobs and dials and sockets, and people start experimenting with that. But then the game changer is when the Moog company brings out the Mini Moog in 1970, which is the first synth that has a keyboard, and quickly followed by the ARP 2600, the ARP company being the other kind of real mover when it came to the development of these keyboard-led synths. So that's a pivotal moment. That's when that paves the way to a lot of artists from all kinds of genres to start to dip their toes in the water. Before that, it's really there's a kind of fad for it for those big telephone exchanges, but it's really only artists that have got a ton of money, the likes of the Monkees and the Beatles, and film soundtrack people like that. Also, I mean, Walter Carlos, who made the famous record "Switched on Bach." So there's bits and pieces, but once the keyboard-led synths come out, that really starts to change the game. So there's that. Um, and then there's Stevie Wonder, who gets in tow with these two producer guys, young sort of hippie producers called Robert Margoulev and Malcolm Cecil, and they've constructed this crazy device called that they call Tonto, which I think stands for the New Timbral Orchestra. And what they'd done was basically the early synth keyboards were monophonic, which meant that you could only play one note at a time, so it wasn't possible to play chords. And they were starting to bump up against this with the synths that they were working with. So Malcolm Cecil was a guy from London, was a real sort of electronics brain, and he hit on the idea of attaching different synths together so that you could play more than one note at the same time. And they get more and more into this, and they essentially build this what becomes a kind of spherical studio. They get an architect and a master carpenter involved, and they build this sphere that an artist can kind of sit in the middle of, and then you've got the producers kind of at the outside messing with all the knobs and dials, and essentially acting as the producers. So they do bits and pieces. Kind of this is 71-ish into 72, and also they release a record of their own called Zero Time, as they call themselves Tonto's Expanding Headband, and Zero Time is a classic synth record. And anyway, Stevie Wonder comes across this record. Stevie has already been kind of turned on by Switched On Bach and the Monkees and stuff like that. He's already kind of very interested in synths. Goes to visit their studio, Media Sound. Well, they don't own the studio, but that's where Tonto's set up. Media Sound's just beside Central Park in New York. And Stevie essentially he wants to go and experience this synth for himself. He's kind of clutching the Zero Time record, and so begins his kind of 4-year kind of purple patch of creating great music, or the best music of his career, starting with Music of My Mind, which comes out in 72. So Music of My Mind is an incredibly pivotal record as far as the R&B community goes. It turns on all kinds of people onto the possibilities of synth. People like Marvin Gaye, people like Kool and the Gang, people like the Ohio Players, and so that is a very important moment along the way. And then after that, if you jump forward to, let's say, 1977, you have P-Funk, and Bernie Worrell, who's their kind of master keyboard synth player. He's been kind of developing as a synth player throughout the 70s, pretty much in tandem with Stevie Wonder. There's a whole that's a whole kind of story in itself. But and Bernie does various other interesting things with synths along the way. But the thing that really stands out in 77 is he plays the Mini Moog on Flashlight, which is a great record in itself. But he plays this kind of sort of very hopscotchy, grindy bass sound, this kind of hyperactive and brilliant, and is copied by a million R&B dance records in the late 70s and into the 80s. People like the Gap Band, Rick James. Man, I mean, so many. You could the list is almost endless. But that is absolutely foundational. So that's pivotal. Same year, I Feel Love comes out. That's Donna Summer over in Munich, collaborating with Giorgio Moroder and Pete Bellotti. I mean, without going into the whole story behind that. That record is one of the various things that record's really important for is the fact that they auto sync the various elements. It's pretty much entirely made by synths except for the kick drum, and everything that isn't made by a synth is auto synced so that it's completely locked into place, and that really blows people's minds that can be done. And one of the people's minds that blows is Nile Rodgers, who is at the time in I think they're called the New York the Big Apple Band, or the New York City Big Apple Band, jazz fusion kind of band that are very popular in New York. But when he hears I Feel Love, he realizes he needs to go disco. He needs to move into a different band. He needs to steal Roxy Music's simplicity, and he needs to steal he doesn't realize that there's an auto sync thing going on. He thinks he's just hearing the tightest band in the world, and so his one of the key components to Chic, even though Chic are not a synth band at all, really, is to try and mimic this very machine-like sound. And that influences a ton of other people, including Leon Silvers and all the rest of it. So that's pivotal as well. So you've got all that going on, and then what you have, two other things just worth mentioning, or let me say three, but I'll mention them really quickly. You've got the arrival of polyphonic synths in the late 70s, particularly the Prophet 5 and the Oberheim OBX. And within a couple of years, these synths are becoming a bit more affordable. So whereas in the earlier 70s with the monophonic synths, you didn't have to be quite as rich as you did to own a modular, but you still had to have a fair bit of money, and you certainly had to have a decent record deal. Whereas by the time you get to about 1980, 1981, they're still expensive, but you start to see guys that are on the indie labels that can afford to get their hands on synths now. So that's a change. Plus, they can play chords, and by and large, apart from Tomto and one or two other innovations, most people are having to make do with the limitations of the technology until the polyphonics come along. So it kind of changes the sound. So you've got that, and then you've got the disco sucks movement, which peaks in mid '79 with all the records being destroyed at the Chicago White Sox Stadium. And disco is basically completely untouchable from this point on, and so that heralds a shift in the way that the music sounds. Even though you wouldn't say it's a synth related thing exactly, but the mood that predated that was one of the reasons why Quincy Jones told his team when they were making Off the Wall to steer clear of disco, and also when and hot on their heels, Solar under Solar Records, which is the label that Leon Silver's the producer for, the kind of master producer. They are tacking in a very similar direction, and also very influenced by Chic. So that's very important. And then meanwhile in Minneapolis, you've got Prince doing all kinds of experiments with synths right towards the end of the '70s. And interestingly, whereas Team Quincy and the Solar Records actually use synths very subtly, they tend to layer them, and you often can barely hear that there are synths on the record. Prince takes a much more kind of lurid, in-your-face approach. You hear records like Soft and Wet, that those are very foundational to the Minneapolis sound. So if you're talking about what's happening in the '60s and '70s that really informs all this, maybe that's my summary. But yeah, you could go on. There are other
Yeah,
things too.
yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, so a lot of the uh, music described in this book would fall under the subgenre known as boogie. I guess
Mm.
maybe post disco, maybe, or maybe even synth funk. Those might be interchangeable some, but I guess for our viewers and readers who never heard the term boogie, kind of how would you describe that, or maybe what would be some examples of songs that would fit into that?
Yeah, I mean it's a tricky thing to put your finger on exactly what it means, and maybe to an extent that's true with all genres, But I think maybe it's even more true when a genre is given a name after the event. I don't know when exactly they started using the term boogie. I know that the place to find out is if you read Greg Wilson, the DJ. Who was very big in the '80s. He has a website where he writes a big history of this, and he talks about exactly when that term started getting used. I can't recall exactly when it was, but it was certainly after the event. And so yeah, that doesn't help. But with that proviso, it's definitely not disco for one thing. It's slower, whereas disco tends to be sort of 125, 130 BPM. Boogie sits much more in the kind of 105 to 120 zone, so it's slower. It's kind of grindier. It's got more of an R&B flavor. It tends to have a lot of space in it. Disco isn't always, but is often pretty busy. The boogie sound, partly because it's quite jazz inflected as well, it tends to be a bit looser. So it's kind of all those things. It does a lot with hand claps. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's without wanting to tie myself down any further. And don't ask me exactly where post disco stops and boogie starts, because
Yeah,
ask
yeah,
an academic, because
yeah,
I don't really know the answer. But if records that I would say are kind of classic boogie records, you would say something like Patrice Rushen's Forget Me Nots,
yeah.
Kashif's Lover Turn Me On, George Benson, Inside Love, Odyssey, Inside Out, the Mary Jane Girls, All Night Long. They would all be what I would say. If you want to kind of look it up in an encyclopedia, what are you going to find? I would say those are records that you would find.
Mm-hmm. Well, great. Yeah. So, I guess, what would be this might be hard to narrow down, but what would be three tracks that are essential to any like 80s synth funk R&B playlist? Like, if you had to like say these three have to be on every playlist, they're that important. Well, which ones would you pick and why?
Okay. I'm going to say I'm going to cheat slightly with the first one,
Okay.
the Whispers and the Beat Goes On. And the reason I'm cheating is because it came out just at the tail end of 1979, but it was a hit in 1980.
Yeah.
So if I can get away with that, and why would I say that? Well, it's just so good. There's something so magical about it as a record. Something about the way it kind of it feels like it starts almost halfway through the record. Um, Something about those magical hand claps, which I think they recorded in the toilets of the studios where they made it. This was Solar Records, Leon Silver's, by the way. It's kind of the pinnacle of Solar. The amazing singing of Scotty and Walter Scott. If I've got I think that's anyway, the Scott twins. Uh, and uh, and just and again, it follows that real tightness that Leon Silver was a huge fan of Chic, and also I think it was, and again I want to say that I know Kashif, who the New York producer Kashif and Paul Lawrence, who worked as a team, they sampled, I believe, the beat from And the Beat Goes On for, I want to say it was Evelyn Champagne King's Love Come Down. If I've got the right record, it was certainly one of the big Evelyn Champagne King hits. And the Beat Goes On lived on for that reason. It's also just got great, subtle, delicate synth work through it. So it's just an absolute, like, Lamborghini of a record. I mean, it's just
Yeah.
it puts me in a great mood whenever I hear it. So definitely that. I would say You're the One for Me by D Train, which comes out in 1982. Um, and that is that I mean, again, almost goes without saying that these are again brilliant records. So I don't I don't want to overstate that, but you've just got this gorgeous. Well, I mean, maybe the first thing to say is, right, one of the things that's really interesting about D Train is the two guys that were in the group. You've got Hubert Eaves, this seasoned jazz pianist from Minnesota, from Minneapolis, who by this stage is in his mid-30s. He's done various things in the 70s. He's looking like his time might have passed, and he hooks up with this 19-year-old kid from Brooklyn, James D. Train Williams. He gets his name because he's an American football player, and he ran at people like the D Train, the subway trains that went from, I think it's from the Bronx to Coney Island, or whatever it was. So he's a kind of tough jock of a guy, although also a really music guy. So they're an odd combination combination, these two. And so that's really interesting. And the song starts with this gorgeous gospel a cappella part from James Williams. I mean, it's just iconic. The record feels like a real leap forward. The emphasis on synth, although they use a real drummer, everything else on the record is done by synths. I think it's pretty much all a Prophet Five. When I was referring earlier to how Prophet Fives were one of those new polyphonic synths that got into the hands of guys on the indie labels. This is one of the records I definitely had in mind. These guys are on Prelude Records, which is a kind of underground dance record label based in New York. And really very a long way from the mainstream, if you like. So it's very important for the use of the synths, and that amazing kind of glassy synth riff that's very jazz influenced because of Hubert Eaves's background, which is quite different to a lot of other things that you hear. And also Francois Kevorkian, one of the great New York DJs, he was in the studio working with Eaves behind the console and really helping him to stay focused on what's going to work in a club. And that's a real shift. DJs suddenly actually being involved in making records. That's not, we haven't really seen much of that until this point. So it's important for that reason. And I'm sure there are other things I'm forgetting. The other thing I really probably would say about it is, the way that James Williams sings throughout the record, this really sort of kind of quite aggressive sort of soulful take, which nearly meant that the record they didn't get a deal. A lot of the labels, compared to the much sort of smoother singers that were popular at the time, a lot of other labels turned it down because they thought Williams was too in your face. But he goes on to really influence a lot of dance music to come. The house, people like Colonel Abrahams, records like Love Can't Turn Around. It's hard to imagine these kind of records coming out if it's not for James Williams and the way he sounds at that time. So absolutely amazing record. And then, what else would I mention? Well, Let the Music Play. Let's go for Let the Music Play, right? Which is, just because, by Shannon, of course, 83. And that record is pivotal because, for one thing, I mean, so in 82, electro explodes in New York, which is basically the combination of a kind of real hip hop aesthetic and mixing of different records together with synths and with a real kind of influence from people like P-Funk and Kraftwerk. And that kicks off with people like Africa Bambaataa and the Johnson Crew. But these are all fairly niche, and it's not until 83 where Herbie Hancock's Rocket comes out and Shannon's Let the Music Play. These are records that are big hits. And Shannon's record. It takes the electro sound, but it kind of combines it with much more of a pop aesthetic, and the guy who is behind all the music, Chris Barbosa, he's a Puerto Rican DJ from the Bronx, so he brings more of a Latin flavor, which most people would say that this is the record that kicks off the whole freestyle sound. Everybody from Lisa Lisa to Taylor Dane to Expose and whatever, so really important in that sense. Madonna doesn't make Into the Groove if Let the Music Play doesn't happen first, and also it's one of the early records that uses samplers. It samples "Looking for the Perfect Beat" by Africa Bambaataa in the beat. This lights the way towards all of the beat sampling in hip hop and all the rest of it, and the explosion that's going to come out of Chicago, Detroit, the whole thing. I'm not saying it necessarily absolutely starts with this record, but it's an early example of it. So all these kind of reasons, and a lot of that is why I chose to name the book after it. Partly because it's just an amazing song. I mean, one of the things I love about it is the way that and actually exactly the opposite to both And the Beat Goes On and You're the One for Me, both of which almost kick off with the chorus. Let the Music Play is more your classic example of, you've got an amazing chorus, and you make the listener wait and wait and wait for it, almost to the point that you're slightly drumming your fingers, and then bang, and you're not disappointed when it comes in. It's just genius. And one of the reasons it's so good, I mean, Shannon's just got this amazing kind of, she's almost the female equivalent of James Williams. Her kind of real urban, gritty street voice is also very important to a lot of the stuff that comes later. But their masterstroke with that is they combine her vocal with this guy called Jimmy Tunnell, who's a Texan, and he sings in a falsetto, I want to say, in that song and in other Shannon songs. And there's something about the way that their voices blend. I think he only comes in the chorus, and it just takes it up to it just knocks you off your feet when you hear it. So there you go. Yeah, but I could choose another 20, but that might be my favorites of
Yeah.
all.
Great. And it's handy
So,
that at the beginning of each chapter, you have a list of songs that you'll be discussing in that chapter. So that's great.
yeah.
If you want to pick up the book, let the music play, and you can make a playlist that way. But
Mm.
that's really all the time we have for. Unfortunately, the time limit's almost over on Zoom. But yeah, thank you so much, Steve, for speaking with 360 Sound, and everyone, buy the book. It's on Velocity Press. Should be, I guess, available on their Velocity Press website, and I guess wherever books are sold, huh? So
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and it's going to be appearing in US bookshops as of probably later this month. It came out in the UK a couple of months ago, but it's just about to land in the US. So yeah, should
great.
be should be in good bookshops that care about music as well.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Well, great. It's an excellent read. Highly recommend it. Yeah. Thanks again, Steve, for speaking with us.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for
All
having
right.
me.
Yeah. Take care.
Bye
Bye.
now.